First of all, I'd like to state that we are not just under a climate crisis. We are also under a biodiversity crisis with a huge number of species and ecosystems being lost. And also we are threatened by a resources crisis because our ecological footprint goes much beyond nature's capacity to renew these resources. And we also have a peace crisis, as you know, with the war in Ukraine. And that interferes with our capacity to deal with this long-term crisis that indeed threaten humanity, as we know. I would like to run through three of the conferences that we had promoted by the United Nations last year in 2022, because we will get an idea about the main issues concerning climate justice and the way the negotiations might help saving the planet. So first of all, we should look at Stockholm. In June, we commemorated 50 years of the first conference that took place in 1972, the same time when the book Limits to Growth came out, and the United Nations Environmental Programme was created. It was a very important conference that looked at the next decades in terms of what would be the future of the environment and humanity. But when we actually go back from 1972 to now, we see that only about a tenth of the hundreds of global targets that have been set in the areas of environment and sustainable development have been achieved or made significant progress. Also, we are using now 3 times more the natural resources than we used in 1970. And the poorest half of the global population owns just 2% of the total global wealth, while the richest 10% own 76% of all wealth. So indeed, we have a very unequal world where the poorest half of the global population, for instance, only contributes with 10% of the greenhouse gases emissions, while the richest 10% of the global population emitted more than half of total carbon emissions during 1990 to 2015. Let's look at other numbers. A person born today would live in a 4 degrees Celsius world, and that is several degrees warmer than today, in which 16% of species would be at risk of extinction. Your exposure to heat waves can be up to 7 times that of a person born in 1960. Humans have altered 75% of the planet's land surface, 60% of the ocean area, and destroyed 85% of one of the most important ecosystems, wetlands. The amount of natural resources tripled also since 1970, and high-income countries have consumed the most of these resources, and carbon dioxide consumption footprints are now 13% times more in rich countries than low-income countries. Concerning financing, we are far, far away from the 2.3 trillion euros that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development would believe would be necessary for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, no country now is giving its citizens what they need without transgressing planetary biophysical limits. So indeed, from Rio de Janeiro where we have poor communities of color being affected by heat waves due to the urban heat island effect, to Pakistan, where we have a direct influence in poor women that work outdoors, and where we will have problems with the number of stillbirths and premature deliveries due to an increase in temperature. Or again, in India, where we reached in last year a temperature of almost 50 degrees Celsius in May. And of course, the relationship between the loss of land due to climate change, in particularly aggravated droughts and war, as happened in Syria. Many parts of the tropics, in particular home to 3 billion people, will experience unbelievable, unlivable heat and humidity if global temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And unfortunately, that's what is happening. We do have many areas around the globe where we are over the climate tipping points, from the Arctic sea ice to the Atlantic circulation, coral reefs being destroyed due to higher temperature, the Amazon rainforest in danger, and of course, positive cycles like the permafrost that is melting and releasing huge amounts of methane. So, except for a couple of events like the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the global financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic, our emissions have been increasing substantially, and not in a uniform way. So we should look at historic responsibility, where the United States and Europe stand as the most important countries or bloc of countries in terms of emissions throughout the last decades. We do see countries with a very different amount of CO2 being emitted. And China is currently the most relevant one, followed by the US and then EU and India. But when we look at per capita, we can see that we have huge differences, for instance, between India with 1.8 tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year, compared, for instance, with almost 7 times more by the USA. We are indeed going to a 2.8 degrees Celsius increase compared with pre-industrial levels if we don't do urgent actions to mitigate emissions of CO2. This conference was really important, with 35,000 participants last November, and a lot of issues were at stake. And that's what I will try to explain you briefly. What were the main talking points, and how we went from hope to a setback, even though with some good decisions. So this was the entrance of COP27. It was the Africa COP. So it was supposed to have a particular attention to the most vulnerable countries that we actually find in Africa, where emissions from these countries are very low, and they are suffering already the consequences of climate change, in particularly floods and droughts. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, was quite clear in his message we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Either we close a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact. And these are some images within the main conference rooms. And one of the issues that were supposed to be discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh was a long time problem for the developing countries, particularly the most vulnerable, which is loss and damage. We're not talking about adaptation to climate change, but how to deal with events, climate change, extreme events, where we need to rebuild the areas afterwards, such as, for instance, a hurricane or an extreme flood. Then we also had to tackle mitigation, adaptation, and climate financing. Civil society was there, but on a very limited way. They could only march, we could only march, I would say, within the UN premises. And indeed, no climate justice without human rights. We are not yet defeated. And this was the voice of the Climate Action Network International throughout the conference. Demonstrations were indeed limited, but still they took place with hundreds of people within the conference. Again, the voice of the civil society.
Fighting for justice. Fighting for justice. We are the activists. We are the activists. Mighty, mighty activists. Mighty, mighty activists. Fighting for justice. Fighting for justice. And for liberation. And for liberation.
So after 30 years of discussion, we finally got a mechanism to support the vulnerable countries. And this was discussed in 2013, also in 2019. But now we do have a fund that was created with a set of financing modalities, and that will work to provide the most vulnerable countries with financing when they have a destruction related with climate change, particularly by extreme events. But we had a setback on mitigation. We had no agreement on ensuring peak emissions before 2025, or more ambitious goals by all countries, or the reduce of end the use of fossil fuels. And on climate financing, we were supposed to get $100 billion every year from developed countries to developing countries for both mitigation and adaptation. And we still didn't get to that target. And the next COP will be challenging because we really would like to reinforce this fight, the gradual and permanent elimination of all fossil fuels, and increased ambition to keep 1.5 degrees alive, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just stated recently. And we need to have concrete climate financing. So the challenges are known. We need to stop fossil fuels. We need to pay the climate debt that the developed countries, by the use of cheap energy in the last decades, now through climate change, are damaging the most vulnerable. We need to ensure financing, and the Paris Agreement is clear on the targets, and those targets have to be amplified after 2025. We need higher civil society participation.